Hello, everybody. Welcome to the live class. We are going through 3 weeks now. We've been going through the entire Bible, right? We've covered the Old Covenant, the Old Testament. We've gone into the New Testament, what Jesus has done for us. And now the final 3 weeks of this long series we've been on is all going to be on the end times. So we're covering, it's going to start with Daniel. Then we're going to cover Matthew 24, and then the third week we'll be going into Revelation. So I know this is what a lot of people have been waiting for. I'm very excited to talk on it. This will be, in my opinion, probably the area where you learn the most new things. And the reason I say that is because Western theology has been so, what's the word I'm looking for? So poisoned, that's a good word for it, by theology that came about in the 1800s. So just a quick recap is that in the 1800s, for most of Christianity's history, 2,000 plus years since the death of Jesus, we had one theology about the end times that was pretty consistent. There were some disagreements, but mostly consistent, very victorious, very understanding of how the Bible worked in context and understanding Revelation, Matthew 24, and all that. And then Calvin came and started changing things in the 1500s. It still wasn't that far off, though, but still some major changes. But then in the 1800s, a man named John Darby came on the scene and had some wild ideas and developed this futurism, dispensationalism belief system about the end times that unfortunately now most of Americans and Europeans hold to in the Western church. In fact, I think it's spread even further than that. I think it's most of Christianity in general still now believes this. But the reason it's spread is because when John Scofield created the Scofield Study Bible in the early 1900s, it was the first study Bible, and so people were very excited about it. And his notes on the end times and Revelation and stuff pulled from Darby, his interpretation of everything. So people grabbed this Bible, the Scofield Bible, and they read these notes, and all of a sudden that's how they learned about the end times. And it has permeated now most of the church since then. And what you're going to learn as we go through this is that, that is not the historical belief system of the end times and what happened in Revelation, Matthew 24, Daniel 9, and also that biblically speaking, it's much very inaccurate compared to what I'm about to show you. So strap in, and it's going to get interesting. And because this one is going to be so different for many of you, please hit me up with questions. I would love to answer your questions. So write them on the Patreon or hit me up in the Discord, and we can talk from there. All right. I might even do a follow-up Q&A when this is over if I see it being necessary. All right. Okay. Let's get into this. Where did my box go? I just lost it. That's fine. Just in case live chatters have anything to say. All right. You guys ready? We need to jump right in. All right. Here we go. Understanding the end times, starting with Daniel. Now, why are we starting in Daniel? Well, the reason is because it's important to understand the whole progression where we're going. Now, Daniel is the only Old Testament book that is really attributed some end times theology, at least in the way that most people understand it now. And so we're going to start there. And next week will be Matthew 24, and then we'll end in Revelation. But all of them are going to tie in, as you're going to see. So in futurist eschatology, which is the main eschatology of the modern church, the parts of Daniel are connected with Revelation. But there's a problem here because Revelation and Daniel actually do not go together at all. In fact, there's almost nothing that you can pull together, despite the fact people try very hard. And part of this is that both of them are not about future events. Now, that's what's going to blow a lot of your minds. But bear with me. We're going to get through this. A lot of this is due to the failure of understanding kingdom in our present reality. Now, if you've been in this class, you understand kingdom at this point. We've talked about it a lot, about how Jesus ushered in a new covenant, how we're living in a new kingdom, all of that. So you guys understand that now in a way that most Christians have never gotten to this point. But when you don't understand that at all, it's this misunderstanding believes that it's got to still come because of this futurism. So in relation to the new covenant, Daniel 9 has two main views that are futurist. And these are dispensationalist. That is that the new covenant is not eternal. In other words, it was what Jesus did was only for a season before a new covenant is truly ushered in. This, of course, goes against Hebrews 13:20, which we just covered Hebrews, and so you guys would know this. But in Hebrews 13:20, it's very clear the covenant with Jesus is eternal. It just says it in the Bible. There's no disputing it. But dispensationalists still do. They have created this belief system and believes God never prophesied about the church in the Old Testament. We are God's plan B since the Jews rejected Jesus. Now, I've heard this before. It's not prevalent, this particular view, everywhere, but I have heard this before, that Jesus came to the Jews, and because they rejected him, he went to the Gentiles. But that's simply not true. Jesus came for all of us. He came through the Jews because that's who he was prophesied, because they were the ones God preserved the lineage through because of the promises to their people throughout the Old Covenant. But Jesus didn't come to the Jews just to save them. He came to save the entire world. There is no plan B. But in this belief system, we Gentiles can't be under the new covenant because it's only reserved for the Jews. It's their promise. It's their covenant that is supposed to come. Jews are his real people. You see this a lot in Christian circles these days, where there's a overzealous affection and desire and promotion of the Jews in their minds. But it's simply just not biblical. They hold Jews in higher regard than Gentiles. That I have seen a lot in my life. There is a special reverence towards the Jews in Israel it's not biblical at all. And yet they've taken Old Testament prophecy and brought it into the New Testament, even though most of that's already been fulfilled. And they've just elevated Israel to the special place that it simply should not hold. Not that it's bad, not that there's not stuff God's doing over there, not signs God's doing through there. All of that's true. But the relevance and the idea that everything revolves around Israel is simply not biblical, and it comes from Darby and his futurism dispensationalist views. Now, there's another belief system in futurism that believes we're in a dual covenant, that God still honors his covenant with Abraham through the Jewish people, that the covenant with Abraham is not for the Gentiles, it's only for the Jews, and it's still being honored, despite the fact that it's clear, as we've talked about in other classes, and I've shown you in the Bible, that Abraham's covenant was fulfilled through Jesus and the giving of the Holy Spirit. Abraham's covenant is fulfilled. There is no holding on to that for the Jews anymore, but they believe that. And so what he did is Jesus and the Gentiles, Jesus created a separate covenant for us. So the Jews still have this covenant with Abraham, and we have a covenant with Jesus. So two covenants at the same time. It sounds crazy, but people believe this. In these views, many believe the old covenant will be reestablished in Jerusalem. Animal sacrifice, the priesthood, red heifers, etc. And they believe that Antichrist will become the abomination of desolation, destroy rebuilt temple. Now, we're going to touch on that in a minute here. But this belief system is that part of what God has to do is he has to give the Jews back their old system in order to see the fulfillment of everything so that we can enter fully into the kingdom afterwards. Again, it's actually not biblical at all. It comes from major twisting of scripture, jumping through hoops to get there, and really poor theology and understanding of context and history. But nevertheless, this part right here is viewed to be true by almost all modern Christians. It's very sad, but there is a great movement getting us back to good teaching. And what I'm teaching you today is actually spreading very quickly because it is the truth and because it's dividing and destroying. Once people see it, they can't unsee it. Let me put it that way. That's what happened to me. I was very much a believer in this, very much so. I was reading all kinds of stuff, waiting for the end times, waiting for things to get worse so Jesus could come back, all of this. And I truly believed all this. And obviously wasn't helpful. But what I'm teaching you now is what I've learned and what opened my eyes. And I've talked about my journey before, so I'm not going to rehash it here. But the point is I was a great, deep theologian when I believed this stuff. And that has not changed. That my love for the Bible, my love for study, my love for understanding the gospel, the Bible history. But what has changed is seeing how it connects. And now that I see it, I can't unsee it. And that's what I'm trying to do for you guys. Why? Because one of the reasons is we are already in the new covenant. So these cannot be true. There cannot be a dual covenant, and there cannot be a waiting for a new covenant to come only for the Jews. And I've already proven that in the other classes, so I'm not going to do that here. You can go back and watch the old ones if you want to understand that. We're not waiting for anything to be given to us from Jesus, but God is waiting on us now, his church. One of the reasons we know this is true is because it says in Revelation 19:7 that when Jesus comes back, it is coming back to a ready bride. In other words, a bride, and it says made herself ready. We know the church is the bride of Christ. We know it's the body of Christ is the bride of Christ. We know all this to be true. It's biblical. So it doesn't say Jesus or God prepared himself to get married. It says the bride made herself ready. We're not waiting on Jesus. He's waiting on us. And that's very important to remember. Jesus brought the kingdom and has been growing ever since with us as ambassadors. This is just, you cannot disprove this. This is completely, it's the evidence is so overwhelming. But just like it says in Isaiah 60, the spread of his government, the increase of his government, shall have no end. It has been growing ever since Jesus died. Matthew 13:31-33, Jesus compared the kingdom to leaven. It keeps spreading. The leaven comes into the bread and it spreads until it's fully in the bread and the bread rises. In AD 100, 1 of every 360 people were Christian. Very few people. And that's AD 100. That's 70 or 60, actually 70 years exactly since the death of Jesus. 1 of every 360 people. Today, 1 out of 3 people are Christian. 2.3 billion Christians in a world of 7 billion people. Pretty incredible. Sorry about that. Let me turn this off. Okay. So we are expanding in numbers and influence over the last 2,000 years. Now, let's talk about popular end times beliefs. Most Western Christians believe we are still waiting for the end times. And in waiting for the end times, we're waiting for the kingdom to come, as I've already talked about. This is the mainstream belief. This is futurism. Futurism means we've put stuff in the future that we're waiting for. Okay, that's all futurism means. It's that simple. But under futurism comes many different ideas of what the end times will look like. You can be pre-trib, post-trib, pre-wrath, post-wrath, amillennial, all this stuff. Premillennial, blah, blah, blah. All of this stuff. There's many different views within futurism, but futurism means that the end has yet to come in this sense of the word, that the new covenant needs to come through Jesus. And it's putting a lot of things in the future, that Revelation, everything. But as I'm going to show you, really the only thing left in Revelation to happen for us is the return of Christ. Everything else, almost everything else has been fulfilled. Almost everything. Return of Christ and a couple other things in 19 through 22. So in order to do this, they pull in Daniel 9. They believe in the rapture of the true church with no Christians left over. So this means that one day we'll be standing around and gone like that. Here's an interesting thing to tell you. There is no word, the rapture, in the entire Bible. And there is no real theology to the rapture, except for one passage in Thessalonians that says we will be caught up in the air with Christ. And we could talk about that passage another time, but that one passage, that's it, has been used to create an entire doctrinal theology about a rapture where we all disappear one day and we're in heaven while the world goes to hell. But unfortunately, it just isn't true within the context. In this theology, they believe the sun, the moon, the stars fall to earth and do damage. And within this 7-year tribulation that starts, which is a great oppression of Christians and persecution, they believe that 3.5 years in, the temple in Jerusalem will be rebuilt. So that old covenant reestablished, the Mosaic covenant reestablished, the law reestablished, the covenant of sacrifice, animal sacrifices, priesthood, all that. They believe that the temple will be rebuilt in Jerusalem, in Israel. And this is why they believe Israel is so important. And they believe it will happen, and this will come about. And so 3.5 years in, temple rebuilt. Now, some people disagree on the timing of all this stuff, but this is what most people believe. And then there'll be 3.5 more years. After this, we are raptured. We're gone. Most people believe. Some believe we will go through this. But during this time, their old Jewish ways are reinstituted. And then the Antichrist comes. And he sits in the temple. And then wrath is brought because what the Antichrist does. And there's a great tribulation, pain, war, suffering, horrible things. And at the end of this tribulation, Jesus comes back, comes to Jerusalem, sits on the throne for 1,000 years, and we live on earth under Jesus's rule, and everything is hunky-dory. It's great. No pain, suffering. Jesus is in charge. He rules perfectly. This is the belief. However, there's a lot of problems with this. Number one, it doesn't recognize the fulfillment already of Abraham and David. Again, watch my class from 2 weeks ago, I think it was, where it's proven in the New Testament that this has already happened. Jesus fulfilled this. But this futurism doesn't recognize it. The 7-year tribulation is never mentioned once in the New Testament. You can't find it anywhere. There's some mention to 3.5 years in Revelation, but nowhere is there a 7-year thing in the New Testament. Okay, it comes from Daniel, but we're going to talk about that. Even Darby's people, when Darby created this theology in the 1800s, believed in just 3.5 years because that's what Revelation mentions. However, in the 1970s, a book came out, The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, one of the biggest bestsellers of all time. It put the fear of God into people about the end times. All kinds of terrible theology, very scary stuff delivered to a people in a Cold War who are afraid of nuclear winter. And Hal Lindsey created this book, put it out there as if we are about to go through hell. He put his own beliefs into the Bible. And this book was so huge that it convinced millions of people that to change their theology based on this. And this is where we get the futurism really. So it started with the Scofield Bible, and then it really took off with Hal Lindsey. Introducing futurism makes it the dominant eschatology in modern Christianity. This man has a lot of power. Now, funny story, I know Hal Lindsey. I worked at a golf club for 3 years where he lived. He lived in the community where the golf club was, a private club. And he would come in and eat all the time. So I talked to Hal Lindsey a few times. I know him. Seems like a nice guy. But the wildness is that his book and his theology that he brought to Christianity, modern Christianity, is one of the most harmful things ever brought to our faith. And we'll talk about that later. But part of it is because it's introduced fatalism that promotes evangelism, which is getting people saved, but has no hope to impact society. In other words, we believe, if you believe in futurism, you believe the world has to go to hell. It has to fall apart so that Jesus can come back. And so because of that, the focus is only on saving souls and very little on changing the world to be better. Now, there are Christians in the middle who believe we can change the world for better for now. And they talk about grace periods, and they talk about it's not happening yet. So for now, we got to do this. And they're kind of like trying to have their cake and eat it too. But the truth is, there's only one truth, and that is that the world is meant to be continuously bettered by Christians as we grow in influence and number until we get to the end where we've gone as far as we can and Jesus comes back. Daniel 9, which many people attribute to being the bringing on of the Antichrist, is actually prophesying the coming of Jesus. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. So, historical understanding of Daniel 9. Daniel is captive in Babylon, and he's trying to figure out how God's coming back to bring us back. By us, I mean the Jews. The Jews were captured by Babylon for 70 years. And Jeremiah prophesied this, so he would know that. Daniel knew 70 years. So he's praying into God delivering us, letting this 70 years be the end of it, and how's it going to happen, all this stuff. So he's praying into this, and he praying for his people to have their land back, their freedom back. And he's praying about the 70 years, asking God to release Israel, and then he has this encounter with Gabriel. And in the encounter in Daniel 9, he says, "While I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sins of my people Israel, and making my request to the Lord God for his holy hill," which is Jerusalem, "while I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I'd seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice." And he says, 77s are decreed for your people in your holy city to finish transgression. Interesting. 77s, holy city to finish transgression. Holy city being Jerusalem, Israel being your people, being the Jews. To put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Know and understand this. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Anointed One returns, get this. Word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Okay, that is clearly Gabriel's talking to him about the restoration of Jerusalem when you guys get out of Babylon, not in some far, far future. Because he says, until the Anointed One, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench, but in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, the Anointed One will be put to death and will have nothing. The Anointed One be put to death. Who do you think that is? Who do you think the Anointed One is? That's Jesus. Now, so Jesus is gone at this point. And now we have a new person. The people of the ruler who will come and destroy the city and the sanctuary. The end will come like a flood. War will continue until the end. Desolations have been decreed. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. Confirm a covenant with many for 1 7. That is where people think there's going to be this tribulation. In the middle of the 7, the 3.5 years, they will put an end to sacrifice and offering. I just told you guys how the futurists interpret this. And at the end, at the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end decreed poured out on him. So this is where, because of this second part, starting here, where is it? Right here. After the death of the Anointed One, where it says the people of the ruler, this is where people think it's Antichrist from this until the end of this. And then they go back because they understand this to be the Antichrist, and they make almost this whole thing about the Antichrist. Most people. Anointed One, though, is clearly Jesus. Who else could it be? Nobody. Except for John Darby, who said it's the Antichrist. But how would that make sense from an angelic standpoint, Gabriel talking on God's behalf, that the Anointed One, who is always Jesus, okay, God would never call an Antichrist Anointed One. But Darby did and introduced this idea, which now many Christians believe. However, it's a clear picture of Jesus because he ended sacrifice and offering, which we know is true. I've already gone through this with you guys. But futurists see this as a bad thing. They think that ending the sacrifice and offering actually was bad because it stopped the Jews from being the Jews. And that's why they believe we need to bring it back, and why the Jews need to bring it back before Jesus can come back. But before Darby, almost everyone believed Jesus was the Anointed One. Nearly everybody. Matthew Henry, is one of the greatest commentaries on the Bible ever. His book's like this thick. It's like every verse of the Bible, he gives all these thoughts. He pulled together all his history. Lived in the 1700s, so 100 years before Darby. Okay? You could still buy his commentary today. And it's just proof of what people believed before Darby. He wrote, "We have in Daniel the most illustrious prediction of Christ and gospel grace existing in the Old Testament." So, Matthew Henry, everybody before him, recognized Daniel 9 to be about Christ and the gospel. There's no mention of an Antichrist at all. Doesn't exist before Darby in Daniel. So, let's look at the 77. 77 is 490 years. There is literally almost no one who disagrees with this. It's too clear. Why? Because history backs it up. The only disputed 7 is the final one. The first 69 are verified. So, what's 69 years? 483. Nobody can figure out the last 7. But they believe it's the last 7 is the tribulation that's in the future. However, it's pretty ridiculous to believe this. Why? Because history proves it to us. Look, the 69 sevens that first come from 457 BC, which is from when Artaxerxes decrees the rebuilding of the temple. Let's go back up to Gabriel's words real quick. Okay. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, there will be 77 sevens and 62 sevens. What's 7 plus 62? 69. Okay. After the 62, people will come and destroy, and then we'll go into the final 7. All right. But here's what I'm talking to. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. All right. Now skip ahead. From the time the word goes out, in 457, Artaxerxes decrees the rebuild of the temple. So, 69 sevens is 483 years. That takes us to 27 AD. What is in 27 AD? Jesus is exactly 30 years old because Jesus is born in 3 BC. It's just the truth. Sorry. They screwed it up. He wasn't born in 0. He was born in 3. So, 27 AD takes us exactly to when Jesus is 30 years old, when he begins his ministry. 69 sevens until the revealing of the Anointed One. The Anointed One, age 30, at the end of 69 sevens, starts his ministry, is revealed. This is unbelievably accurate prophecy. There's no disputing this. This is unbelievably accurate. We know this to be true. So, this is crazy. All right? Think about how accurate that is. Now, his ministry lasts 3.5 years. Interesting. His death ends the old sacrifice and offering and makes the old covenant obsolete. Those of you who watched my Hebrews video know this to be true. It's proven in Hebrews. So, let's back up for a second. If you believe the futurist view by Darby and Hal Lindsey, which most Christians believe, that 69 sevens, 483 years, that starts with Jesus' ministry from the decree of the rebuilding of the temple, takes us 483 years to that point. And for some reason, even though that was completely accurate, they believe the final 7 was stopped and is still in the future. How does that even make sense, first of all? How does it make sense that there would be a skipping period? Gabriel didn't say there'd be a skip. He didn't say there'd be 2,000 years until the final 7. Nothing like that at all. The excuse is made that it's separated so that they can use it. They have all their wheels and ways of playing this game, but it doesn't work. And I'm telling you, I used to believe that. I no longer do because it doesn't make logical sense. If this prophecy is so accurate that Daniel gave of the 7s, how on earth could it be that that final 7 is in the future? So it means it had to have happened quick, right? Well, let's look at it. So 69 sevens to Jesus' ministry, 3.5 years. That's halfway through the final 7. Guess what? His death and sacrifice and offering. Wow. The old covenant is now obsolete. Exactly. Daniel 9:26. The people of the ruler who will come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and will come like a flood. War will continue until the end. Desolation will be decreed. That ruler comes against Jerusalem. Most of church history recognize this as Titus, who destroys Jerusalem in AD 70. Most of church history until Darby. Again, this all started in the 1800s. Daniel 9 is a 5-part prophecy about the Messiah and the introduction of the new covenant. Tells the year of his arrival. We've already proven that. Tells of his death. Proven again. Tells end of old covenant. Bingo. Tells confirming of the new covenant. Yes. And tells about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, this is the part that most church people don't understand. Thank you, John Darby. Thank you, Hal Lindsey, for screwing up our theology. This is what people don't understand. And here we go. Remember, first 3.5 years, ministry lasts. Death ends, sacrifice and offering. Exactly as Daniel predicted. So we have 3.5 years left in our timeline with the 7s, okay? 3.5 years left. So far, we've gone 486.5 years. Perfectly predicted by Daniel. And we can time it perfectly to Jesus. So what happened in that last 3.5 years? Here we go. The last 3.5 years go from Jesus' death to the stoning of Stephen. Here we go into Acts. When the members of the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and gnashed their teeth at him. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. At this, they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him, dragged him out of the city, began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul, who became Paul, the greatest evangelist ever. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. He fell on his knees and cried out, Lord, don't hold this sin against them. When he said this, he fell asleep. God spared him a horrible death. Interesting, right? So for 3.5 years from Jesus' death till the stoning of Stephen, the Jews had not yet begun their major persecution of Christians. There was still like a trying to figure out this whole Jesus thing that happened. But then 3.5 years after Jesus died, they went all in and started killing Christians, led by Saul. This is the grace period, 3.5 years, the final 3.5 years. But now the Jews had decisively chosen the old covenant over Jesus. And this is just, history proves this. Okay. So let's go back up to the 7s. All right. 7 sevens. The word will go out, restore and rebuild Jerusalem. The 7 sevens and 62 sevens. It will be rebuilt with streets and a trench in times of trouble. After the 62 sevens, anointed one put to death, and will have nothing. In the middle of the 7, in the middle of the 7, they will put an end to sacrifice and offering. That's Jesus' death. And at the temple set up an abomination. Okay, so we're at the end of this. The 7s have ended. Now what happens? Now we're getting to the abomination of desolation. So Jesus mentions in Matthew 24 and Luke 21, he quotes Daniel 9 about the abomination of desolation approaching the city. And when you see it, flee to the mountains. He says, pray it doesn't happen on the Sabbath. Why? Because on the Sabbath, Jews couldn't travel more than 3/4 of a mile, but they would need to flee. Let no one on the housetop go down. Why? Because there were flat roofs back then. They used to hang out on their houses all the time. You didn't want to be in the streets. Streets, people were walking. Horses were pooping. Camels were pooping. You didn't want to be in the streets. So when you hung out on the roofs, the flat roofs. Common in that day. How dreadful it will be for pregnant women nursing mothers. Why? Because they have to flee. And yet, when you're pregnant or have little ones, it's very difficult to travel. And you also are taking care of your young ones. I mean, it's tough when horrible things are happening. Here, let those in Judea flee to the mountains. This shows us it was localized to Judea. Now, people take this passage and apply it to the entire end of the world. But why? How does that even make sense when Jesus says this? It makes zero sense at all. Great distress, Jesus says, unequaled from beginning of the world until now. Beginning of the world until now. This clue says it cannot be the end of the world. Okay? It just cannot be. Worst event ever in the history of the Jewish people was the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, some might be like, well, the Holocaust, 8 million died. Fair. But the population of the world was much smaller back then. And so when 1.1 million Jews were killed in the destruction of Jerusalem, that means almost all Jews were killed. 8 million people in the Holocaust, horrific, terrible. But as a percentage, this was more. But not only did he kill over 1 million Jews, he destroyed the Judaic system and the priesthood, including the temple. All records of genealogy for priests were destroyed, so they can no longer be a Levitical priesthood. All of the law books were destroyed except for the Old Testament. But at that point, they'd gone from 200-something laws in the Old Testament, and the old law, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Numbers, they took all those laws and they'd added another 400 laws on top of it from the time of Ezra to Jesus. All of that's destroyed. So their entire religion is destroyed. No priesthood, no temple, which means no sacrifice. And they can't rebuild it because they don't have anything they need to rebuild it. We went from Mosaic Judaism to rabbinical. So now it's about wisdom of the rabbis. And guess what? The Christians listened to Jesus. Every single Christian fled to the mountains of Pella. And Josephus records not one Christian killed. Not one. By some, and Eusebius records this too. How could that be unless the Christians knew that's what Jesus was talking about? I'm just saying. Jesus gave amazingly accurate prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem. From AD 33, the 490-year window of grace closed. Remember, he said it would be a window of grace. He says it up here. Gabriel says, whoop. All right. Where is it? 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression. So a grace period. Put an end to sin, atone for wickedness, bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy and anoint the most holy place. They had 77 years, or 77s, 490 years, to get their act together, to get ready for Jesus and the new covenant. This is amazingly accurate. So, in this 77s, in this 490 years, they got their temple back, their city back, they got the law back, they got Jesus, their Messiah, and they got the chance to follow him, and they got the chance to reject him in 490 years, exactly as Gabriel told Daniel and Daniel prophesied. So, the window of grace closed after the stoning of Stephen, and history begins moving to the climax of the Daniel 9 prophecy with destruction of city and sanctuary through the abomination of desolation, AD 70. So now, as I've already proven in our other classes, we're in an unshakable kingdom and an eternal covenant. So, going forward, next week, we're going to go really deep into Matthew 24 and Luke 21 a little bit too. Because many people take Matthew 24 and put it into the future. The problem, as you guys should already be picking up on, is that it just doesn't work. Not when you take the whole context of the Bible and history. It does not work. Now, everything I just said, there's going to be questions. Of course there are, and that's fine. Ask me. I'm happy. Discord, Patreon, hit me up. But understand this. There are still things to come. I am not what's called a full... what's the word I'm looking for? I can't even think of the word right now, but there's a word for my beliefs that means that I think everything is done, and basically all pain, suffering, and anything imperfect is now a figment of our imagination. We just got to wake up from it. I do not believe that at all. I don't believe Jesus has already come, anything like that. There is stuff still to come. However, all this belief of an Antichrist, by the way, Antichrist is mentioned only in one book of the Bible, and that is in John, where John talks about an Antichrist spirit coming into the world. A spirit, and he says it's even here now. He was talking about Gnosticism. Had nothing to do with a big bad Antichrist figure. I've already proven to you guys how in Daniel, that's not about an Antichrist at all. It's proven. I don't see any way you can understand it differently unless you just gotta keep fighting, which I get it. There might be some fighting these beliefs for a while. But there's a reference to a man of lawlessness in Thessalonians that is used to be an Antichrist. And then, of course, in Revelation, the beast and his prophet. So that there's a lot of that believes in the Antichrist. We're going to go through that, okay? But the fact is the word Antichrist is used only in one book in Scripture. It's John, and it's talking about a spirit that's already come into the world, which is the spirit of heresy, specifically at that point Gnosticism, which Gnosticism permeates almost all heresy. We can talk about that another time. So the fact is that there just isn't this big bad Antichrist coming. It's just not happening. All this horrible other stuff, this tribulation, this reestablishment of the temple, this reestablishment of the old system, none of it has to happen for Jesus to come back. Zip, zilcho, booyah. That system is forever destroyed, and it needs to stay forever destroyed. Because, first of all, it can't be reinstated because the records are gone. There can be no Levitical priests anymore. Next, the old law can never be returned. It's all destroyed, except for the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, with God's law, not the created law that the Jews built up on top of that. None of it can be restored. Sacrifice and offering, never to be restored. We're not supposed to sacrifice animals ever again. So, hope you guys understand that. Very intense stuff because a lot of it is not what most people believe anymore, and that's okay. So, questions, comments, please bring it to me. Next week, we go deep diving Matthew 24. We're going to go further down this road, and then we're going to end in Revelation, and then we'll touch on more stuff after that, depending on what you guys are grasping and what I feel like needs to be addressed. So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed class. This is pretty intense stuff for most of you, I know, because it's hard to imagine your beliefs being so different. But this is much more accurate biblically and historically based on my past 12 years of study. So I came to it the hard way as well. Just letting you guys know. It's not what I always believed, but I just can't unsee it now that I've seen it. And I look forward to continue sharing it with you guys. God bless y'all.